Thank you. Thank you. It's very kind of you to receive me. This is a surprise visit. I was last in the northern country in July and August of 1817 on my first tour of the country. But whether you know it or not, this is a somewhat different time. This is 11 years later, and this is my surprise visit to the area. I am indeed James Monroe, your erstwhile 5th President of the United States. John Quincy Adams is our sitting First Magistrate, and this, of course, is August of 1828. Mr. Jefferson has been dead for more than 2 years, and I miss my old friend of 40-some years, but I'm rich in the friendship that I have with Mr. Madison, who lives but 30 miles to the north of my property, Highland, which is just 3 miles away from Mr. Jefferson's Monticello in Albemarle, which is not far from Charlottesville, Virginia. And now that Mr. Jefferson is dead, I speak more often of my oldest boyhood friend, lifelong political foe, but always a faithful comrade at arms in our fight for independence, my hutmate at Valley Forge. I speak to you of John Marshall, Chief Justice of the United States. That should please many of you. He's a surviving Federalist. And of course, he was always a distress to his second cousin, Mr. Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Marshall detested each other, not simply because of their political differences, but because they are related to each other by way of the Randolphs, and the Randolphs of Virginia are prone to madness. Well, I wondered what I was going to say to you when I got up this morning. Sometimes, I think there's some seating arrangement here if you want to come in, sir. Some people don't want to get too close to an old president, or any president for that matter, but I wondered what I was going to say to you when I got up this morning. Sometimes Mrs. Monroe says to me, "Well, Colonel, start talking and presently you'll think of something." My Mrs. Monroe, always prone to stepping beyond her compass. There's not much I can do about it. I adore that wife of mine, mother of my 2 surviving children. She's given them the best formative education any children could expect to have. And she has kept my household in a Lilliputian form of good government. Everything done at the right time for the right purpose and then quietly put away. If government could do that, I'm sure we'd all be much, much happier. You know, Mrs. Monroe has been a part of my career. She's gone almost everywhere with me. Well, no, she wasn't with me when I was a Continental Congressman, and I went as far west as the Mississippi River. I've always shown an interest in the West, and I learned to appreciate the North Country as well. In fact, the people of the West have called me a man of the Western waters. I was quite pleased to have that title until Henry Clay took it away from me. Henry Clay will take anything if he thinks it'll improve his hopes for the presidency. I don't think it will, but never mind. That's what he does. And Mrs. Monroe wasn't with me when I was involved in treaty making as a Continental Congressman in 1784. I came all the way up to just south of the Great Lakes and saw that man who was the terror of your frontier. I speak to you, Colonel Joseph Brant, that Mohawk Indian. Amazing man. It is interesting what human nature will do. You know, he would sit down for a while and translate the Book of Common Prayer into his own tongue and get bored with that and go out and get a few scalps. It's just human nature, I suppose, to not to be predictable. Well, in any case, I didn't know Mrs. Monroe at that time. I didn't get to meet her until I was a part of the old Continental Congress, and we went to New York, and I met her at a ball in Lower Manhattan, not far from Fraunces Tavern, where General Washington said goodbye to his officers for good in December of 1783. You know, you can say what you like about the old Congress. When it didn't do anything, it simply had the good grace to move along. Mr. Jefferson was convinced that Congress should be permanently housed in a huge wagon. And when it was necessary for Congress to move, you see, it was a matter of hitching up. Off all the members of Congress, you see, would take off. And Congress certainly did a lot of moving. You may recall before our success at the Battle of Trenton in December of '76, Congress got frightened and left Philadelphia and went to Baltimore for a little bit. And I would remind you of something. In that time period, until March of 1777, Congress had given near dictatorial powers to General Washington, and he readily surrendered those powers, power to a rope of sand, because it was the legitimate thing to do. Well, of course, Congress came back from Baltimore to Philadelphia, and then something happened. That terrible disaster on the 11th of September, the Battle of Brandywine Creek. Our General Washington's army was almost double enveloped. It could have been the end of everything. And of course, General Howe came into Philadelphia, and you could understand Congress couldn't stay there at the same time. And so Congress went to Lancaster and York. And then finally, when we effected that treaty with the French, the British felt that they had to leave. They were overextended. They had to go back to New York City, but not before we were able to meet them on the open field for the first time with some success at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. And then, Congress sort of languished in Philadelphia, did nothing at that time. It was a bladeless knife without a handle. And finally, some officers and some men hadn't been paid for ages and came down to visit Congress. And this terrified Congress. So Congress left Philadelphia and went to Princeton, New Jersey. That wasn't far enough. And then down to Trenton, and then down to Annapolis. And then from Annapolis, you see, back to Trenton, and then from Trenton to New York. That's not a very interesting story, but it's over. Recently, oh good, whatever it is, it stretches. Recently, I've been working on a manuscript, The People, the Sovereigns. That's you. If you ever forget that, it's not good for the Republic. And I put it into the hands of my son-in-law, George Hay. He's my political advisor. And he said, Colonel, that's what people call me. They call me other things too, but we're not going to talk about that. He said, Colonel, I think you have some good ideas in this manuscript of yours, but it's virtually unreadable. I like people who will be straight, but I don't like people who are being cruel. I thought he was rather cool in the way he put that. But he said, what you ought to do, instead of writing things that nobody's going to read, you should talk about yourself. Oh, you poor people. Some of you have had dinner. This is the end of the day, and you're going to listen to an old politician talk about himself. Well, you're trapped, you see. My life is intertwined, that of Mr. Jefferson's and Mr. Madison's, for nearly 50 years. I took a wound in securing the Declaration of Independence at the Battle of Trenton, and 7 years later I found myself standing side by side with Congressman Jefferson in Annapolis, Maryland, to sign the final protocols of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which brought our fight for independence to a successful conclusion and announced to the world that hereafter we would no longer be subjects of a monarch, but citizens of the United States of America, a republic, if you and I can keep it. But I stand before you this evening as the only convention anti-federalist to become president of the United States. Dissent is part of my nature. Dissent is part of my loyal service to this country. And so 4 years after standing side by side with Congressman Jefferson in Annapolis, Maryland, this time I found myself standing side by side with Mr. Jefferson's nemesis, Patrick Henry, at the Virginia State Constitutional Convention in Richmond in June of 1788, to challenge my new friend, Mr. Madison, to make sure that a Bill of Rights became an integral part of the United States Constitution. You see, when the proposed Constitution was sent out by the framers from Philadelphia in September of 1787, to what? To be ratified by us by way of our elected constitutional conventions, that proposed Constitution was seen by thousands of Americans as being a codification of the powers of government with insufficient protection for the rights of the people. In a real sense, The revolution had to continue, and did so peaceably, putting the Federalists on notice that those 10 amendments that we say are so precious to us today become an integral part of the Constitution. And very much to Mr. Madison's credit, he effected that in Congress by December of 1791. Now, there's nothing in youth. You are youthful, and I am old. To prepare you for the vicissitudes of old age, save one thing, and that is a consciousness of duty faithfully performed. Now, when you reach the portal, I will have reached the portal long before all of you. You will not have your health. You will not need your health in the portal. You'll be dead. And you will no longer have your wealth for any kind of comfort. If you've accumulated any wealth, your heirs will have shown some interest in that prior to your departure. And you will no longer have control of your reputation in the portal. Your reputation by then will be in the hands of others. But if you've had an understanding with Providence or God as to what it is that you were to do on this earth, and you have done it, then I am convinced that you will have in the company of the deity a consciousness of duty faithfully performed. But that, my friends, as you know, is not a sometime affair. It's a lifetime affair. I give you a case in point. Collectively, Mr. Madison and I have served this country for nearly 100 years, and it's our intention to continue to serve until we drop. Now, several weeks ago, he and I finished our work for a spell as the senior members of the Board of Visitors of the University of Virginia. Now, in 1826, the University of Virginia had a problem. It was not the looming death of its founder, Mr. Jefferson. I think Mr. Jefferson, before he met the students at the University of Virginia in the spring of 1826, had been prepared for his end. I was privy to a letter that he wrote to one of his own. He said to that young man, "You must adore God. You must love your neighbor as yourself and your country more than yourself. You must be just. You must be true. You must not murmur at the ways of Providence, such that the life into which you've entered becomes the portal to one of inevitable bliss." Now, there was a man who seemed to be prepared for his end until he met the students at the University of Virginia in the spring of 1826, and they brought him to tears. In that year, there were 114 students, and periodically all of them, or so it seemed, would roar around the grounds and beat up all the faculty. And that was not considered a good sign for a new institution that had just opened its doors the previous March of 1825. And so with the death of Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Madison became the rector of the university, and I, with my military background, was brought in to apply the rod of heaven to the misgivings of those students. And they came around soon enough, all but one. His name was, yes, Edgar Allan Poe. He had to go. In any case, Mr. Madison and I put aside our duties at the university, and before going to our respective homes, we decided to go up the hill from the University of Virginia, where the Declaration of Independence had been conceived. You know, of course, I'm talking about Monticello. Now, maybe some of you will move south, as I know you're inured to the cold here, but you may decide to go further south as things get colder, and you may want to come to Charlottesville, and I must tell you right now, there is no reason for any of you to go to Monticello. Monticello is in a high state of decay. It took Mr. Jefferson 40 years to build that magnificent house, and it's falling apart, as every man-made structure on this earth will eventually fall apart. So now I want to ask you something. What do you suppose we will be remembered for many generations from now? Happily. What do you suppose we will be remembered for? Do you suppose we'll be remembered for our power? Oh, well, talk to the Assyrians about power. Talk to the Babylonians about power. Talk to the Romans about power. Talk to that fellow that I had 2 meetings with in Paris about power, Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, you can't. He's dead. He died on that miserable island in the South Atlantic in 1821. And have you forgotten what he said? Have you forgotten? He said, the art of government is to keep the people reasonably happy. To do that, one must give them what they want, or what they think they want, so as to extract from them everything one can get. To do that, he said, one must know men. Men, he said, are moved by two levers, fear and greed. And if you want them to behave, you must manipulate both levers simultaneously. Now you know what happened to our sister republic, the French Republic, when good men failed to do their duty and a man on horseback came along. No, we will not be happily remembered for our power many generations from now. What about prestige? That's simple enough. Where power goes, so goes prestige. Well, what about the prospect of prosperity? What about the prospect of prosperity? Even now, we in the South are still suffering from the Panic of 1819, the worst depression this country has ever seen, and we'll see more. No, my friends, it will not be power. It will not be prestige. It will not be the prospect of prosperity. If we are remembered for anything, if we have made a contribution to civilization, it is to the idea of rights and responsibilities. When we went to war with Great Britain, it was not simply to separate from the mother country. It was to achieve some higher form of freedom, which in principle, we have achieved with a constitution that says an individual possesses certain basic rights, rights that cannot be encroached upon by government, rights that are written down, rights that are guaranteed, rights that can be defended against the government in the government's own courts. Never forget, since Magna Carta of 1215, that's new. If we keep the Republic alive, if we remember to do our duty. So there we were, two old men outside of dead Monticello, each of us lost in his own thoughts. Mr. Madison has recently put his affairs into the hands of his stepson, who's turned out to be a drunkard and a gambler. I'm sorry to speak ill of another, but it's demonstrably true. And I left the presidency in March of 1825, $75,000 in debt. $75,000 in debt for serving my country. I would do it again. It is a privilege to put whatever you have at the disposal of your country if you love it. Nevertheless, no sooner had I left the confines of Washington City than my creditors were hard upon me. You know, your friends may lose you, but your creditors never lose you. Yeah. So we decided to do something on that mountaintop. Something that some of you, when things are difficult in life, will do in your own way. Madison and I decided to take another oath on that mountaintop. Another oath to continue to serve our community and serve our nation until the end of our days. And when we did that, it's as if a weight came off of my shoulders and I reached down for Mr. Madison's hand. He's about 5'2" and getting shorter every week. And I grabbed him by the hand. And the two of us, like school children, skipped around Mr. Jefferson's West Garden. For we had resolved to function in adversity and finish our lives in some state of grace, whether we had a penny in our pockets or not. And you will do the same in adversity. Now, Mrs. Monroe always discourages me from talking about what I'm going to talk about. But when you've been married as long as I have, you have to disobey now and then. I'm going to do it. She's not here. And you're still here. I don't think a man begins to understand himself until he has failed. Did you hear what I had to say, gentlemen? I don't think a man begins to understand himself until he has failed. Then and only then will he know what it takes to get up again and persevere. I've held more senior executive positions than any other president today. I've been president of the United States twice, the second time re-elected without opposition. I've been Secretary of State and Secretary of War, and at one time during the War of 1812 under President Madison, I was simultaneously Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and military governor of Washington City. A bit too much ambition there, but I was determined to be President Madison's successor. I've been a Confederation congressman 3 times, a U.S. senator once, your minister to Spain once, your minister to Great Britain once, your minister to France twice, second time working closely with Robert Livingston and Francois Barbe-Mabois and Jean-Maurice Talleyrand and First Consul Napoleon for the purchase of Louisiana, which has not only doubled the size of our country, but enabled President Thomas Jefferson to send the Lewis and Clark expedition into sovereign American land, not land held by a hostile France and Spain. And I want to remind you of something. That purchase of Louisiana is the largest acquisition of land in modern history without resort to war. When I became your president in March of 1817, we had one secure frontier after the War of 1812, and that was the Atlantic Ocean. When I left office 8 years later, we had secured much of our northern frontier. You know about that. East of the Rocky Mountains, we demilitarized the Great Lakes. You know about that. We pushed the Russians out of Northern California back into Alaska from whence they come. I strengthened the Navy. I strengthened the Army. I finished up Mr. Jefferson's conception of West Point. I realized we needed a place to train a cadre of professional officers, that the Army and militia had not performed universally well during the War of 1812, and given us the beginning of fortifications running from the eastern seaboard all the way into the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. I purchased Florida. You shouldn't hold that against me. I've given us the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819 with the Spanish, which has given us a whole new border just north of Texas, up from the Sabine River, up from the Red River, up from the Arkansas River, up to the 42nd parallel. We're coming up to the 49. And then a swath that goes due west as far as the Pacific Ocean. And then in December of 1823, in my 7th message to Congress, I gave us what may well become the bedrock of America's foreign policy, the principles of 1823. Lately, people have been coming up to me and said, well, now, President Monroe, at your age, you can expect to die at any time. Your name needs to be attached to this thing. Yes, the Monroe Doctrine, which in effect says the following: that North and South America should no longer be subject to colonization in the future, that the republics of North and South America are a peculiar lot, and if any foreign country attempts to meddle with the nature of these republics, would that invite an unhappy response from the United States? Eventually. But I said 2 other things in that doctrine. Fearful of the impetuous nature of some commanders-in-chief and some commanders, and I'm not just talking about Andrew Jackson, who almost got us into a 3rd gratuitous war with Great Britain when he went into Florida and executed 2 English subjects by the name of Arbuthnot and Ambrister. Perhaps his names like that, they should expect to be executed. But never mind, they were English subjects, for goodness sakes. We almost had a 3rd war. I said 2 other things in that doctrine. I said the United States should not get involved in the internal affairs of other countries. And implicitly, that the United States should not get involved in any foreign wars, save as those wars are pressed upon us. I know something about war on more than one level, as some of you do. I carry a ball on my shoulder to remind me of war. War, whatever its achievement, is always the sink for all cruelty and injustice. Wars never end by the justice of men. Wars end after the destruction, after the carnage, after the ready means of making war are exhausted, and then finally men come to the table, if there is one. You may be interested to know that I lost my table after the Battle of Bladensburg, and the British were going to do to Washington what we did to York. And I said to my assistant, Mr. Pleasanton, you get back to my office. You open up the bottom right drawer, and you take good care of my charge. There you will find the original engrossed Declaration of Independence, the original engrossed Constitution, and General Washington's commission, and you grab them, and you take them to Leesburg, and you bury them. And that's where they stayed for 3 days, until it was safe to bring them up. Oh, I've done it. Mrs. Monroe is right. I got off the subject. We were talking about how things go wrong. For me, in my career, everything was going well until I got to Philadelphia. Now, there's nothing wrong with Philadelphia except in the summer. But I was a new United States Senator from Virginia, and I liked nothing more than trouble. And what I thought my job was to harass Hamiltonians to Federalists. I know that many of you have those sympathies, but I was young then, and I needed some help. Well, who was going to be helpful to me in this miserable business? New York was a great help to me. Aaron Burr said, "Oh, I'd like to get in on this," and he did. And then those two Clintons, uncle and nephew, got into the picture too. Clinton, there's a name that's likely to crop up again. And we made life miserable for the Hamiltonians. This was the beginning of the two-party system that President Washington couldn't stand. But what distressed him? It was one of those things you have to do out of conscience, but you know it's going to be a terrible price to pay. When General Washington, or President Washington, enunciated his neutrality proclamation to keep us out of war, a noble idea to keep us out of the war in Europe, what did he do? He did it unilaterally. Any president who can unilaterally declare neutrality can do what? Just as easily declare war without going through Congress. Well, he had a simple solution for me. He seduced me into becoming America's first minister to the Republic of France. And I arrived in Paris 5 days after Maximilien Robespierre, the great dictator, had been decapitated. All hell had broken loose in Paris again, and I spoke a kind of French best understood by Virginians. Enter my Mrs. Monroe to begin to save the day for the future 5th President of the United States. She spoke very nice French. She was so beautiful in the eyes of the Parisians. If you don't want to do some business in Paris, have a beautiful woman at your side. They called her La Belle Américaine. She took a direct interest in saving the life of Adrienne Lafayette, the wife of General Lafayette, the true hero of our fight for independence. And she was wonderful. La Belle Américaine, beautiful American. You know, she's so beautiful all these years later. But 2 years ago, she took a fall into a fire and burned a third of her body. And now she's taking drops and drops and drops of laudanum. Laudanum, as you know, is a combination of opium and alcohol for the maintenance of pain. I say to the youth, it is well you develop your character when you're young, because if you manage to get old, you're going to need it. Well, in any case, I ran afoul of the Washington administration and I was recalled. That's a very nice diplomatic expression for you're fired. And I came home thoroughly fired in 1797, which was excellent preparation for my next presidential firing, this time 10 years later at the hands of my closest neighbor and best friend, President Thomas Jefferson, who in 1803 had sent me back to Paris to buy a little land. Well, I thought that worked out all right. I wanted to come home. How do I make my living? I'm a farmer, for goodness sake. Oh, he said, no, sir, Colonel. You're still on duty. I want you to leave Paris. I want you to go to London. I want you to get the Brits to stop impressing or taking our sailors. I arrived in London, and the Brits said, no, oh, Minister Monroe, you know, we've been impressing sailors for 400 years, and we do have to worry about that little corporal who has designs on our isles. And oh, by the way, Minister Monroe, you do know that your so-called impressed American sailors performed very nicely 5 months ago at the Battle of Trafalgar. I think we'll keep them. That's what broke up the French and the Spanish fleet. I think we'll keep them. And so I realized I'd have to exceed my instructions. Come up with something different. Let the British keep their orders in council with regard to impressment of sailors. Once the little corporal is gone, we won't have to worry about it. It wasn't on the table at Ghent, you know. Never mentioned it by that point, going into Christmas of 1814. So I came up with a treaty. I got a different treaty. I got it back to President Jefferson. I'm convinced, Mr. Madison said no. I'm convinced if that treaty had been pushed on to the Senate likely would have ratified it, and we might not have had the War of 1812. But as it was, I ran afoul of the wags of the Jefferson administration. They punished me. They sent William Pinckney from Maryland over there to London to give me a kick in the derriere. But Pinckney arrived at the same conclusion. We reconfigured that Treaty of Conciliation, got it back to the president. The president tabled it. And then I got a terrible letter in the midst of my career. Am I the only one in this room to get a terrible letter in the midst of his career? It came from Secretary of State Madison speaking for President Jefferson, saying, it appears, Minister Monroe, that your mission to London has been a failure. Maybe you ought to come home. Maybe you're recalled. Maybe you're fired. And I came home thoroughly fired for the second time in 10 years. Now think about this for a moment. Is this not an extraordinary country when a man could be fired by the first president of the United States, his former commander-in-chief, who given him commendation for putting out of commission two Hessian three-pounders at a critical point of the Battle of Trenton, which was a do-or-die battle for his nibs, General Washington, the nation, and then to be fired by one's closest neighbor and best friend, Mr. Jefferson, and then to be thrown into the political wilderness from which I was never, ever, ever to return. But I did, to eventually become the 5th President of the United States. Is there a message here? You know the message. We are Americans. And when we get knocked down, what do? We get up again. When we get knocked down, we get up again. Now, Mrs. Monroe tells me that if I talk long enough, I'll put everyone into the arms of Morpheus. I'm going to do the most difficult thing for any politician to do. I'm going to stop talking. And if you have any questions at this juncture, wise or otherwise, that you'd like to ask of me, I will entertain them. But please keep in mind that I've spent nearly 50 years in politics, and some of my answers are likely to be elliptical. The floor is yours, my friends. I know it's a little warmer in here. I do warm rooms up, and then people either fall asleep or go. I'm here to account for service to this country, and perhaps you have some questions of me. Not entirely pleasant. I'm used to that in life. No. Yes, sir.
What did you expect on your trip from 1817, 1818, your trip through the country? What did you learn and what did you go for?
The impetus was, quite frankly, the president's house wasn't ready. It had been burned. It wouldn't be ready until September. A sane person looks for an opportunity to leave Washington City at any time. And I thought, that people ought to have a chance to see their president. It seemed to have been successful when President Washington made his tour, and I thought I would do that. Originally, it was supposed to be a very quiet tour. I thought what I would do, I am interested and was interested in the making of fortifications. And so when I got as far as Sackett's Harbor, I wanted to see how they were coming along with the Madison barracks. But it soon became an extraordinary trip for me. You know, I left in very early June of 1817, went from Washington City to Baltimore, from Baltimore to Philadelphia, from Philadelphia to New York, from New York to Springfield, Massachusetts, and then from Springfield, Massachusetts to Newport, Rhode Island, and then from Newport, Rhode Island to Boston, and then up to Maine, and then back down again. Managed to get to Concord, and then moved from Concord to Burlington. I think that was it. And then at Virgin, I took a boat, and I guess it's Rouse's Point I covered. And then from there to Malone and Altoona, and eventually managed to get to Sackett's Harbor. And in fact, yes, that's right. I was there by about the 3rd of August of 1817. But my hope was to see likely places where we could put in fortifications, and to talk to the people of the United States. And there were other things too. I wanted my first tour to be north. I'd made 3 tours, as you may know, and the last one was to the south. But I wanted to go into that area where you didn't think of this as the Second War for Independence or the War of 1812. You thought of it as Madison's War. You had your own thoughts about that, and your own livelihood was distressed in ways that other parts of the country weren't. And when the war hawks out of the West were so anxious to have war, they were anxious to to take up the interest of New England when New England didn't want its interest looked after at all, you see. So in any case, and then there was something important for me to do. I needed to be with an old enemy. And 2 things happened to me when I was on the Boston Post Road before I was to meet John Adams. I came across an old Continental officer. That is to say, he was wearing the remains of a Continental officer's uniform. And as I got closer, I noticed that he had a gash in his forehead, and that could only have been done by a saber. And I got off my horse, and I came up to him, drawn to him, and he'd been waiting for me. And I put my hand on his forehead, and he turned and looked at me with tears in his eyes, and he said, "At last I've been touched by the United States." That is part of a president's job in some way, to make sure that the people know that he is there. And to do the bidding of the people. And then finally on the 4th of July, I had a meal with John Adams. It was perfect. John Adams never had anything nice to say about me. As you get older, you either get worse or more mellow, but he decided that not only would we have a relationship, but he became my elector for my second administration. I wanted to ask him what he'd said before. So many years ago, maybe some of you got his response. Initially, he said, in time, all republics commit suicide. We're attempting to do something different. Our republic, in our making our republic, we're attempting to do something different. Are we doing something different? Are we on the way to suicide, or are we perpetuating this republic that the founders had in mind? Well, I'm not sure I answered your question, but I've smothered it. Yes, indeed.
What was your mode of transportation? Horseback, stagecoach, or your own carriage?
Carriage and horseback. I learned something that everybody knew before. I've spent a lot of time on horseback, and I don't know why it always strikes me that I didn't know it before, but I do know it so much so after this trip, that a horse is dangerous at both ends and uncomfortable in the middle. Yes, sir.
Yeah, General Wilkinson, where did he play in the Burr-Hamilton controversy? And what's your personal opinion of it?
It would have been not wise of me, but when things were not going on well on the frontier after Hull and Rensselaer and Dearborn, I wanted to go into the field, and Mr. Madison said no, and I would have an opportunity to serve under James Wilkinson, and I said I'd rather be run through than serve under James Wilkinson, for goodness sakes. Whether it was the Conway cabal in '77, whether it was the nasty business with Horatio Gates, whether there's some inkling that he has an attachment with the Spanish. He may be something called Agent 13. He's perhaps taking a little bit of money. And of course he became involved in the Burr conspiracy too. And every time, the man could never win a battle, but he won every court-martial he ever went through. He's a phenomenon in roguism. It almost gives me a headache to think of that man, that he should survive, and so many other good men didn't. He'll die in his bed. You wait and see. Perhaps this year of 1828. We're all wishing for it. You had to bring up that subject, didn't you? But never mind.
Maybe you'll go to Mexico.
Yes, keep going. Maybe he'll go to Mexico. Yes, I suspect he may have planned, but he's a little old now. He's a little long in the tooth, but never mind. Oh, I'd like him to try it now. The only other man that I could just not be around, and I know I'm thin-skinned, is Armstrong. Armstrong just drove me crazy. I would have loved to see Wilkinson and Armstrong in a duel, but of course that never happened, did it? Yes, sir.
Being related to the Jeffersons through the Tuckahoe Randolph on the James River, I've understood by the scribes and the historians that you and Jefferson were close in two very interesting ways. Intellectually close, and in some of your policies. Could you talk about how you were intellectually close with Thomas Jefferson, please?
You are ever so kind. There is no one who would agree with you on that. Even my Attorney General, William Wirt, was indiscreet enough to say that I had a mind neither rapid nor rich, but that I had a power of concentration such that I might reach the executive. I've punished him. I've made him my attorney general. He'll stay in that position forever. It's a state of misery. So it's kind of you to in any way associate my intellect. You were playing with me, weren't you? I could tell you. No, with that of Mr. Jefferson's. But, you know, when I came out of the Continental line, Mr. Jefferson said, I'll make you a lawyer. He said, it's going to be the most challenging. He was still governor of Virginia at that time. It was 1780. He said, I'll make you a lawyer. But he said, this is what we're going to do, Colonel Monroe. I'm going to teach you history for memory. I'm going to teach you philosophy for reasoning. And I'm going to teach you everything else for a dull mind. And he did. And we did a great deal more than just Blackstone. We went into all kinds of things. And I am so grateful that I was able to study underneath him. I think it fatigued him enormously. What was your other question?
Well,
maybe I've destroyed the premise of the other question. But now you're talking. You were related, so you have a relationship with John Marshall then.
Well,
not close.
No.
I see. I would love to go back and tell him that.
Boyhood at Tuckahoe.
Yes, he did. He did. You're quite right. Well, in fact, so did Jefferson as a young boy.
Thomas Jefferson, yes.
Yes, indeed.
Went around school.
Yeah. I'll tell you, those Randolphs, my goodness. All those boys and all those grandchildren. Well, never mind. We don't have to get into all of that. Yeah. All right.
Well, some policies similarities.
Well, I mean, I feel that I served both men as best I could. I've had an understanding. I mean, when you consider about it, Mr. Madison during the War of 1812, Mr. Jefferson when it came to being Minister Plenipotentiary to France, and I think something has served me well. If you're willing to give the credit to someone else, there's not much that can't be accomplished, and I have learned that. It'd be wonderful if other politicians done that, but they just say, I have to do that because I'm not very clever. I don't know. You had a question, sir.
Your whole early political career was anti-federalist, anti-strong government, but every action you took working for other presidents and in your presidency consolidated power.
But what happened? You can do that when your enemy dies. When the Federalists committed suicide at the end of the war, then it's like you can pick what you like. And then what did I find as President of the United States? That much of what the Federalists had accomplished and what they proposed was in fact the way to go. It's very hard to recognize your enemy when they're alive. When they're dead, you can say nice things about them. Now you spotted that, didn't you? Yeah.
One other follow-up.
Yes.
Any reaction or comment about your last meeting with Eliza Hamilton?
Oh, some people like that. It's a very painful subject, sir. All right. This is a little bit of a history to this. When I was a part of, there were two congressmen and I was a senator, and it looked as if something was not quite in the Treasury Department. Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. And so we had a meeting with him. We went through all the records, and we found that he was squeaky clean in terms of what he was supposed to do with his work. But he was having a liaison with a woman, and that required a transfer of funds, which looked rather suspicious. He did nothing that was dishonorable with regard to his business. So the three of us agreed, I was on my way to Paris in 1794, that we would simply put this away, you know. As long as Secretary Hamilton was doing his work, his private business was his private business. Well, somehow this information got to Mr. Jefferson. And you know anything about Mr. Hamilton was catnip to Mr. Jefferson. And the conduit for this painful subject, was a scurrilous newspaper man by the name of James Callender. You want to know how bad he was? He died in 3 feet of water in the James River. I think he got some help. But he was the one who got this information out. And so when I came back, not feeling all that happy about life, having been fired by the Washington administration, I was challenged to a duel by Alexander Hamilton. He was convinced that I was the one who got this personal information out, which required him to make an extraordinary confession to the people, and it ruined his professional career. And I said I had nothing to do with it. He didn't believe me. We went through the various steps of the invitation for, of course, a duel. And then in the fourth step, my second found a way for all parties to keep their honor, and the duel was called off. You do know who my second was, Aaron Burr, who had an interest in Mr. Hamilton himself at some future date on the 1804 Weehawken. In any case, Mrs. Hamilton, the doyen of society, both of Washington City and New York City, was convinced that I was the one that ruined everything for her husband and herself. Once I was reelected, I decided to go down the street and visit her. You do bring up a painful subject. And I arrived, and the first thing I noticed is that her servant did not take my hat, but that I was ushered into a very small little room, not even a principal room, and I was asked to sit down. And I did sit down, and I waited for Mrs. Hamilton to come down the steps. And I waited. I am the President of the United States, and I'm waiting in that house of hers. And she eventually came down the steps. She looked at me, pirouetted around, and went right back upstairs again. And I realized that this would go on forever. Not a day went by that Mrs. Hamilton, doyen of society, didn't have miserable things to say about me. And you know, she's alive even today. She's going to continue to live forever after me. What does that mean? It means my reputation is in her hands. Thank you so much for bringing this subject up, sir. I hope that's enough, is it? Thank you. Yes, indeed.
Yes, I have a more personal question.
Oh.
I had ancestors who were here not in 1817, but shortly after. What were your impressions of this part of the country when you came through?
My feeling was, when I came here, is that you folks are arduous, strong Americans. We are a little soft in the South in some respects. The soil is better. One of the things that I noticed is that you don't get high corn here. In the South, we readily get high corn. Feeding ourselves, with some assistance, of course, is easy. You are self-reliant and extraordinary people. Sometimes difficult, I think. But never mind, it's all part of Constitution.
You feed yourself with some assistance. So what kind of assistance are you talking about?
You know what I'm talking about, sir. You want to get into
I
that?
haven't said anything about peculiar institution.
No. You want to get into it?
Part of it.
All right. I knew that would come up, so we're going to go ahead and talk about it. But before we talk about it, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Do you drink coffee or tea?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Do you eat sugar? Uh-huh. And do you wear cotton? Then you too profit from the labor of a slave as I do. Now that's established. Slavery in Virginia, the most populous of states, started to die of itself, not out of the goodness of any man's thinking or heart, but because it was no longer profitable to attach slaves or to have slaves as part of the tobacco plantations. The tobacco plantations were getting thin soil all over Virginia, and so many plantation owners decided there were too many mouths to feed, and they petitioned the General Assembly for the process of gradual manumission of the slaves. And then something happened. And we need to follow our history. What happened in 1794? Well, I'll tell you. Eli Whitney came up with the cotton gin, which enabled the black man to produce 50 times more cotton than ever before. And something else began to happen. cotton became very important, and that was happy for your government. How does your federal government make its money? It makes its money through the custom house and the sale of land. So the federal government was selling land for these huge commercial cotton plantations. Now, Virginia could be a breeder of slaves, to send slaves to the South and the Southwest, you see. And the federal government was quite happy about this because we had money to put aside the debt. We also had money to get out of the debt that we owed the English bankers. You know, I was the one who arranged the securing of loans from the British banks so that we could purchase Louisiana. I know when I first went over there, we had a credit of about $3 million. The total purchase was $15 million. And now we were paying interest of 6% per annum on that. So with the sale of this land, of course we had to push the Indians east of the Mississippi to the west of the Mississippi. So now we're facing all those fights, beginning with the Arikara, to create those big commercial plantations. So you have to follow the money. Think about it. I secure money from the British. I pay the French. The French break the Treaty of Amiens of 1803 and go to war with the British. Follow the money. Well, something else happened in 1794. An extraordinary unlettered black man by the name of Toussaint Louverture pushed 40,000 Frenchmen out of that very rich French province. How rich was it? Napoleon sent 30,000 French troops there under the control of, under the command of his brother-in-law. Most of them died, you know. Those 40,000 Frenchmen. And Toussaint Louverture, what a phenomenon. Where did this man get his education? He was known in Europe as the Black Napoleon. He learned the tactics of Spartacus. You remember your history from Spartacus? From 33 BC to 31 BC, Spartacus defeated no fewer than 7 Roman armies until Crassus and Pompey cornered them. All 70,000 of them. And you know what they did? We would never do this. But the late Roman Republic was so desperate, they took that Persian invention and they perfected it. And they took 6,000 of them, including Spartacus, and crucified them with the T-cross, with the Latin cross, and the low cross. And they left them there for 4 months. Anyway, when those Frenchmen came to our shores, what did that mean? It meant that the black man knew that the white man was no longer invincible. And that informed the revolt that I had to put down as governor of Virginia in 1800. That informed the Denmark-Vesey revolt outside of Charleston in 1822. That informed the Louisiana Riverine revolts, and we knew we'd have to do something. I became involved with the American Colonization Society, which has taken freed slaves from the United States, first to Sierra Leone and then to Liberia. And you know, they've named the capital of that, Liberia, Monrovia, after me. It's not going to work. So, until something happens, until we can find a way out of this mess, we hang on. You know, the Missouri Compromise told us we have only so much time. So I bring my slaves close to me. I have 50 of them. But I'm reminded every night of what the situation is, because they're property with feet, so I've got to watch them. But at night I hear them, and they say, the night is dark, the day is long, and we is far from home. Weep, Lord, for we is far from home. This republic is far from home until we find an answer for this. I've put a poll in the room. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned the Almighty back earlier in your remarks. So the country seems like the country in the last 30 years, since the Canton Ridge revival of 1801, has been swept by the fires of faith. What do you think, as an educated Virginian, what do you think of all these revivals that are occurring throughout the country?
Well, you know, I don't speak much about religion. But Mrs. Monroe put the Bible in my hands the other day, and it was turned to John, and I was intrigued because the man of Nazareth was being interviewed by this governor, Pontius Pilate. And Pontius and the man from Nazareth is talking about truth. And you probably know, and Pontius Pilate either says or asks, what is truth? And I'm asking myself more and more at my age, what is truth? What is truth? Am I living in that truth or not? I ask myself. You know, Mr. Jefferson once said to me, he said, can the liberties of a nation be considered secure when we have removed their very foundation? That is, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God and that they cannot be violated but with the wrath of God. And then he said, I tremble for my country when I consider that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. You make me think of these things, sir. I don't have that much time, I know. And yes, sir.
Back to St. Lawrence County for a minute. I'm wondering if you remember a gentleman who had a peg leg, and he was our minister to France. And two towns in this county were named after him.
You speak of Gouverneur Morris.
Morristown and Gouverneur.
Gouverneur Morris.
Did you know him?
Yes, I knew him, and I thought, wasn't it extraordinary what he did with the preamble of the Constitution when he was the one who said, we have to take the word states out of this and make it the people. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Now, otherwise, he was a very difficult man. He never liked me, and he never lost an opportunity to tell me that. But he was an extraordinary man. Yes, I knew Gouverneur Morris, and I'm glad this country had him. I wouldn't have him for dinner. It wouldn't be pleasant, but never mind. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What do you think that the Virginia dynasty's effect was on the United States as a whole?
Well, many people think it's dying because I'm the last one. I'm the last of the cocked hats. Well, I don't know. Could you imagine this country developing without His Excellency George Washington or John Adams or Thomas Jefferson or Mr. Madison? I'm merely a simple servant. I came to understand that what I have to do to keep my balance in serving the likes of the men I just mentioned is to have a sufficiency of hoi polloi in my hoity-toity. Well, yes.
Is it true that you were only at William & Mary for a year?
Well, 74 and until 76. And then by 76, I joined the 3rd Virginia Regiment. And we went up to New York and began a series of retreats that took us all the way back to Trenton. Yes, I was, but I had a sense that where I was going. The College of William & Mary amongst the students was divided against rebels and the namby-pambies. The namby-pambies are the ones that were going to stay close to the king. We knew we were not going to do that. Not a great deal of studying was going on. I couldn't wait to join up, and I was pleased to do so in 76 at the age of 18. Yes, sir.
What do you think of the men that followed you into the White House?
Well, I can tell you that I think John Quincy Adams is an extraordinary man. I don't think the Adamses will ever get themselves reelected. There's a part of them that the electorate will never appreciate, but I will tell you that I could not have done without Andrew Jackson. I could always do without Andrew Jackson. I'm sorry, but I could not have done without John Quincy Adams, an amazing man. And I shamelessly took his motto. His motto was Defendi rem publicam adolescens non deseram senex. I will not surrender in my old age the republic I served in my youth. That was his motto. I decided it was going to be my motto. He was very gracious about that. What an extraordinary young man. Mr. Jefferson never trusted him when he crossed the aisle. You know, he began as a Federalist, as his father. But, well, extraordinary man. He'll be appreciated at some point. you have to bring up Andrew Jackson. That man has more courage, but he always acts before he thinks. And I think that can be dangerous as a president. But the people wanted a hero, and he is a hero. Nobody's carried as much lead in his body as that man has, and still continues to live. So I suppose he ought to be president. Well, if there are no other questions, I would leave you with this thought. When I was simultaneously Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and military governor of Washington City during the War of 1812 under President Madison, there was a man who sent word to us from having seen the bombardment of Fort McHenry. He sent us poetry. He sent us the alternate words. Some of you will know them. And thus be it ever, when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must, when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. Then the star-spangled banner shall wave forever o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. God bless our country, my friends. God bless you in continued service to our country. I thank you for receiving an old president.